Hello and welcome to the Nedgroup Investments Behavioural Investing Summit. It's lovely to have all of you with us today. I'm Amy Jansen, your host, coming to you from Johannesburg. Very excited to be bringing this content to you today. I am a behavioural economist and scientist building behavioural solutions here at Nedgroup Investments. Very special warm welcome to our VIPs, those of you who took the time over December and January to fill in our survey, which we were able to analyze in great detail because of the number of responses and identify 6 South African investing personality archetypes, which we will be revealing later. For those of you joining us from Europe, for our first session, we're very excited to be bringing to you today a global renowned expert in both behavioral science and happiness, Professor Paul Dolan. He is a professor and the head of the Behavioural Sciences department at the London School of Economics. He has 2 best-selling books, Happiness by Design and Happy Ever After, which are my personal favorites in the happiness genre. In addition to his really ground-setting work in the happiness space, both academically and in the popular science space, he also created the Mindspace framework, which is what the UK government uses to inform their behavioural science work. Over and above that, he's worked with many corporates, including Barclays and HSBC. So we're really honoured to have him with us today to tell us the rather surprising science at times about what makes us happy and what doesn't. Thank you so much, Professor Dolan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we're all good. Thank you.
All good. Brilliant. Thank you. So listen, thank you very much for asking me to talk to you today. When Amy emailed me, she said, basically talk about everything. So I've got half an hour. She's like, well, they'll like this, they'll like this, they'll like this, they'll like this. So I've got about half an hour to go through everything that I know. I won't obviously do that. I won't have time to do that. But what I'm gonna try to do is I'm gonna first of all be clear about happiness. I'm going to set that out in a couple of minutes, and then I'll focus on 2 main issues: attention and narratives. I'm going to talk about how our happiness is determined entirely by what we pay attention to and affected by the stories and narratives that we tell about ourselves and our lives. I'm going to try and do those 2 things in a little bit of breadth, but maybe to get into some of the depth to some extent. I'll also try to relate, because of course we're talking to investments and finance and money. I'm going to relate much of what I say to income, to consumption, and ways in which we can use our money to make ourselves and other people as happy as possible. So that's hopefully managed your expectations sufficiently well to have a sense of what I'm going to talk about in the next half an hour. So let me start then with the definition of happiness, because it's important if we're going to be talking about something that we would be ideally trying to achieve or maximize or get more of, that we're very, very clear about what it means. And of course, we've had about 2,500 years of ethical discussion of this issue, and we haven't reached an answer. So I'm not going to expect to do it in the next 2.5 minutes. But what I want to do is I want to be clear that in my conceptualization, happiness is located in our experiences. It's located in what we do, who we're with, and what we pay attention to, which I'll come to in a second. And that's to be distinguished from definitions of happiness that are more evaluative. So one of the most widely used questions in happiness research, and as it applies to policy too, is to ask people questions about how satisfied they are with their lives or how happy they are overall. Now, notice that that's a question that is not located directly in how anybody's feeling, but is an evaluative judgment of how well or badly life is going. Whilst I think those data provide good evidence on something, they don't directly address happiness. Let me give you an example that will illustrate this. And I use this as an example in Happiness by Design, where we went for dinner with my wife's best friend, actually, and she spent the whole of the evening, literally the whole 3 hours that we were at dinner, complaining about every single aspect of her job. She was complaining about her boss, her commute, her colleagues. Everything about her experiences was miserable. And then we stood up at the end of dinner, and she said, without any hint of irony, she said, I love working at Medialand. And she wasn't lying, because when she said she loved working there, what she was doing was telling a story about how that job ought to make her happy. It was somewhere she'd always wanted to work. Her parents were proud. Her friends were jealous. When she thought about whether it should make her happy, it ought to. But that sat in sharp contrast to her experiences, day to day, moment to moment, which were making her miserable. And so I am focusing attention directly on experiences, what we do, who we do them with, what we're thinking about, and how they make us feel. And sat within those experiences are two main components of happiness that in Happiness by Design I loosely define as pleasure and purpose. Simply things that on the one hand make you feel joy, contentment, and the obverse of that, of course, would be sadness, anxiety, worry, stress. These are the hedonic adjectives that are quite widely used in the emotion literature. They're important, but sitting alongside experiences of pleasure are experiences of purpose. These are the things that we find that are worthwhile and meaningful when you're engaged in an activity, when you're, I don't know, it could be at work, it could be doing the garden, it could be playing a game, it could be engaging in an activity that feels like it has meaning or purpose. Not necessarily the most fun things that you spend your time doing, but they feel purposeful. And so I argue that happy lives are ones that contain a balance between pleasure and purpose, between fun and fulfillment. Now, it's not for me to prescribe either what the balance should look like or what things you ought to find pleasurable or purposeful. That's entirely for you to work out. I use gardening as an example. I can't imagine anything worse. I'd rather die than spend my time in the garden. But I mean, in the garden, gardening. But I know that lots of people enjoy that. Lots of people find that purposeful. That's absolutely fine. It's for you to work out what things make you happy. There's going to be enormous individual variation in that. Of course, there will be. People are different. But I do think that we're all the same in regards to trying to find activities, experiences that bring us pleasure on the one hand, purpose on the other, and find the right combination between them. So that's a very clear exposition of what happiness is. The question then is, of course, what determines it? What things make you happy and miserable? And the answer to that question is that it all depends on what you pay attention to. And that's actually been really extraordinarily absent from discussions of happiness. When people talk about, for example, does money make people happy, right? Does being richer and having more assets or whatever make people happy? They assume that there's a direct relationship between the input of money, income, wealth, and the output of happiness. Or as anyone knows who's got any basic understanding of how firms operate, there's a production process, right? You don't just take land, labor, and capital and have widgets. They don't just suddenly emerge. There's a production process that converts the inputs of land, labor, and capital into the outputs of widgets. And similarly, there's a production process that converts the inputs of happiness into the output, the input of income into the output of happiness. And the answer to the question of whether money makes people happy or not is it depends on how much attention you pay to it and in what ways. It depends entirely on that production process of happiness, right? So similarly to how a firm can produce more widgets by using its inputs more effectively, you can produce more happiness by using your inputs effectively, given those inputs, given the amount of money, given the amount of friends, given the amount of sex, or whatever you do with your time and your resources to produce the output of happiness. So that seems to me to be quite obvious, but it's been overlooked. A lot of what I'm going to say, I think, and particularly as I know Amy drew attention to Mindspace in the introduction, a lot of the insights from the behavioural sciences are very obvious, but they're overlooked. I think that's true of much of what we do using behavioural science and wellbeing as applied to policy and practice in organisations, governments, and as individuals. Very obvious insights, but overlooked. So it's a very obvious insight to me that we are what we pay attention to. That wherever your attention is allocated, that will determine how you feel and what you do. And very obvious answer is that if you want to be happy, pay attention to things that make you feel good and withdraw attention from things that make you feel bad. That's a very simple thing to do. And when we look at, coming back to the association with income, when we look at the effects of income on happiness, as measured as experiences, by the way, I need to be very clear, as people live and breathe their lives, pleasure and purpose over time, we find some very interesting correlations. Now, I have to, again, be very clear. Correlations. This is not causal. We'll have no randomized controlled trials where people are allocated to different amounts of money. That would be fantastic. I'd love to be able to assign some people rich, some people poor, and look at the causal effects of income on happiness. We don't have very many of those experiments. So I'm looking at correlational data, which we are challenged in drawing causal inference from. But it's still interesting nonetheless. And what we find is that there are diminishing returns to income. That is, being poor makes people miserable. Now, I think that's really important, because when people glibly say money doesn't make you happy, that's not true. If you're poor, having more money will make you happier. Poverty is very attention-seeking, right? Come back to this attentional resource. That when you're poor, you're paying attention to the fact that you can't pay the bills, you need to feed the kids, you need to pay the rent, you're in debt, it's worrisome, it's stressful, it's anxiety-inducing. All of these things are very attention-seeking. So it's little wonder that poverty makes people miserable psychologically, as well as their kind of conditions and circumstances being poor. But then when you get richer, you stop paying as much attention to it. You can now feed the kids, you can now pay the bills, you can now stop worrying about money as much. But then what's interesting, what we think might be happening then is actually that not only does the happiness hit of income wear off, it might actually also start to fall again when you get super rich or richer and you start paying more attention to money again, right? So we're talking about investments, we're talking about assets, we're talking about portfolio management, right? So I'm thinking, oh my God, I've got all this money, am I using it wisely? Then you start drawing attention to money again, you start worrying about it, right? So there seems to be like a sweet spot potentially when you've got just enough, but not too much. And I'll say a little bit more about the narratives around money and things later. But let me, in the interest of time, continue with this attentional resource thing. So the key point, and this is one of the things I think Amy wanted me to draw out, one of the many things she wanted me to say, was that attention is not just allocated consciously and effortfully. I'm talking at the moment, it's been implicit in what I've been saying, really, that you are what you attend to, and you deliberately choose to allocate attention in particular ways. Well, behavioural science teaches us, of course, that most of our attention is allocated unconsciously. We're not most of the time thinking about what we're thinking about. We're paying attention to what's drawn to our minds through stimuli in our environment, right? So we are driven much more by the context of our decision than the cognition of our minds, driven much more by situational cues and triggers than we are by deliberations. If anyone's read Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kahneman, that's exactly the sort of theme here. The system one is the old reptilian brain. It's very fast, it's very effortless, it's very automatic, it's unconscious. That's actually what drives most of what we do. In contrast to the system two, which is the Mr. Spot brain, which is the more effortful, deliberative, conscious self. And there's lots of examples from the literature about how our behaviour will be driven by automatic cues. So, very nice example from the finance world is if you put an attractive woman on the front cover of a loan offer, you can charge, in one experimental manipulation, you can charge about 25% higher interest than if that attractive woman is absent. Now, what we think is going on there is that you don't actually really know in your system two deliberative brain whether you really want that loan or need that loan with that interest rate over that time frame. That's a very effortful activity. Most of us don't actually know very much about really what we want. So what your old system one brain does is it makes associations in the environment to make your life easier for you. So unconsciously, attractive woman, attractive loan. Now you see, that attractiveness feature applies to both men and women. It's not like there may be some sexual desire thing in there, but it's not really the point. The point is really about the attractiveness of the loan as signaled and cued by the attractiveness of the woman, or it could even be a man, on the front cover of the loan. You make the loan appear more attractive in your system one. Then you consciously, deliberatively see the loan as more attractive because well, that's the easy way out, right? So I can't overemphasize really what behavioral science has taught us over the last 2 or 3 decades. There's so many examples across so many areas of activity where we can show that your automatic unconscious brain will basically decide what to do, and then your Mr. Spock, your system 2 deliberative brain, will validate the decision that's been made by system 1, right? So in this example, you take the loan out, and then I ask you why. Then you give me very good post-hoc rationalizations about why that was a good loan. But you don't say, well, it was an attractive woman, so I found the loan attractive. Not because you're lying, but because it belies below conscious awareness. We see lots of examples where we're activated by environmental triggers in ways that we're not consciously aware of. I could get you to buy more French wine in a supermarket by playing French music in the background. You would know in that experiment, actually, only 17% of people knew there was any music playing at all, right? So, again, I can't say enough. Important role of unconscious processes in drawing attention to stimuli in ways that we're unaware of. So what that means is, if you're thinking about designing interventions to make yourself or other people happier, or, you know, buy financial products or whatever it is you want to nudge or shove people to do, then it's much more effective to design environments that make it easier for people to behave in that ways than it is to try to change their minds about those environments. So I used one example in Happiness by Design. I put in that if you want to spend less money when you go online, you know, when you're going on online shopping, change your banking password to don't spend so much money. And my editor at Penguin, she said, she used a variant of that. And she said, you know, even though I know I'm doing that to myself, it still works, right? So literally every time she went onto a banking account online, she had to type in some variant of "don't spend so much money." She was priming herself, reminding herself, activating herself to not spend so much money. So we can even fool ourselves when we know we're fooling ourselves. There's a good literature on placebo effects, which some of you may be familiar with. Placebo effects work even when people know they're taking placebos, right? So again, I can't emphasize enough how important designing environments is to changing behavior. Think about ways in which you can organize your day, your life, in ways that make it easier for you to do things that will make you happier and harder to do things that won't. The simple behavioral science lesson, Amy and everybody, is the one that, you know, the really simple lesson, the obvious but overlooked. If you want to do something, make it easy. I mean, that is the really, 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 really simple but overlooked observations. But if you think about that for a second, in what you might do at home or in work, is that often you make it really fucking hard for yourself to do things that would make you feel better, and you make it very easy for yourself to do things that don't. So think about simple organizing principles of your time and your activities in ways that would make you feel better. All right, good. So I think I've covered, I hope, Amy, I've covered what you wanted to in relation to attention and happiness by design. You haven't started screaming or shouting at me yet to tell me otherwise, so I'm going to carry on. So I'm now going to move on to narratives and stories. And the reason, there's a couple of reasons for doing this. One is that story that I told you at the beginning about my wife's best friend, you know, having a great job in theory, but an awful job in practice, is a good illustration of that distinction between evaluation and experience, but also how so much of what we do is driven by narratives that we tell about ourselves and our lives, driven by our idealized selves, driven by what our parents expect of us, driven by what society expects, given maybe evolutionary advantage. There's lots of narratives around our behavior, what we ought to be spending our money on, what we ought to not be spending our money on, that are constructed sometimes by us, but a lot of the time for us. And of course, we all know you know, Amy, don't you, that we live our lives in these narratives, in these stories, in these conversations that we have with ourselves and with other people about our behavior and our well-being. And it's one of the reasons on the personal narratives, before I get into the social stories, again, trying to relate some of this back to money, is there is some good literature suggesting that spending money on experiences is better for you than spending money on material consumption. So if you spend money on, it's a bit challenging in the course of a pandemic, of course, but if you spend money on, going to gigs, going to festivals, going out to restaurants, spending money on time with other people, that you report being happier from that expenditure than you do if you buy clothes or shoes or spend stuff on consumption goods. And the reason for that, a principal reason for that, is that you can talk about the festival, you can talk about the gig, you can talk about the night out in a way that there's only so much you can talk about a pair of shoes, right? There's only so much conversation you can have about a new coat or a new jacket or a new car. It kind of gets a bit tiresome when you keep talking about your new car. Whereas you have a shared set of experiences when you spend money on experiences. And so people can draw down in conversations afterwards in the memories that they have of their previous experiences. Because remember that happiness is a flow of experience of pleasure and purpose over time. Some of those experiences won't be when you're paying attention directly to the moment that you're in. It will often be paying attention to memories of things that have already been experienced, and indeed anticipations of things that are yet to happen. So you think about most of where your mind is, actually, it's not in the moment, right? It's in the moment now because I'm having a conversation looking at Amy on the screen. But a lot of the time, my mind is remembering stuff that's happened, good and bad, anticipating what's going to happen next, good and bad. So when we're thinking about spending our resources using our time and our money, not only are we going to be thinking about money in the experience, but thinking about money in the memory and in the anticipation. See, that's really important. It explains why people go on holidays that they don't enjoy, right? I mean, anyone who's been on a family holiday, right? You all know, listening, right? Family holidays for most of the time are not particularly enjoyable experiences, right? You're trying to bring together a family in a place that some of them might not even want to be going away, and you're trying to find shared experiences that different people in the family are all trying to have a good time together, and it doesn't really work very much. You might have a moment where everyone comes together and you enjoy yourselves. That will be encoded in your memory as having been a great holiday, right? So you remember the holiday really well. You tell stories about it. And actually, even if the holiday went badly, you've got stories about how badly it went afterwards. And importantly, you've got the anticipation of looking forward to going away. So one of the things at the moment in the pandemic in the UK, which is really interesting, is there's almost an obsession with whether we can go away on summer holidays. And that's not because I don't think it's even very much to do with whether actually people go away and have a good week or 2 weeks in Spain, but it's whether they can look forward to going away to their 2 weeks in Spain. And that's really fundamentally important to our well-being, is the anticipation of future benefits. And so that's why people will often want to book holidays well in advance. Right, but most people don't. A lot of people don't like the last minute thing, because the last minutes don't give you anticipatory utility. They don't give you happiness in anticipation of the event. Right. So when you're thinking about spending money or using your assets, it's actually, again, really important. Think about not just what's going to happen in the moment of expenditure in the consumption, but in the memory and the anticipation. Okay, so I want to then use the remaining time that I have to talk about not personal stories, but I want to talk about social stories. I want to talk about social narratives about how we should live, and whether and in what way sometimes they get in the way of us leading lives that would make us happy. Because it's all very well talking about pleasure and purpose and attention and environments, but of course all of us sit within a series of constraints and structures and hierarchies and everything else. And some of those things are liberating and they're good for us, and oftentimes they're constraining. And what I talk about in Happy Ever After is some of these stories that might be good to a point, but then might subsequently get in the way of us being happier. And I alluded to this a little bit before when I started talking about the association between income and happiness, is that poverty makes people miserable, but being rich doesn't make them happy. And it's a little bit like an addiction to any good or substance, is that the first little hit makes you feel good. Then you just need more and more and more of the drug in order to get your fix. And these social stories do that to us. It's the drug of addiction to success, to status, to wealth and to education. There's all these things that we think we should be accumulating more and more and more of, irrespective of how much of those things we have in the first place. And some of these effects are really quite pervasive and operate, again, sometimes in unconscious ways. A desire to keep up with other people, for example, right? So that's almost wired in us to reference ourselves against how well other people are doing. There's a really lovely piece of evidence that shows that when someone wins the lottery in your local neighbourhood, then the chances of filing for bankruptcy increase in that neighbourhood, right? So it's essentially people are trying to keep up with the Joneses. They observe someone else doing well. Now they feel like they have to keep up. Now, again, some of that is going to be conscious and deliberate, but oftentimes it's just unconscious. We just get sucked into these comparison processes, but we kind of sort of can't help ourselves being part of, I guess. And so one of the things, the main lesson from this is just acceptance, really, I think. If you think about some of the therapies that people engage in to change their behavior or to, sort of be happier, is that the first step of those therapies is acceptance. Accepting who you are, accepting what you do, accepting how you live. And for me, it's acceptance of these narratives, accepting just how powerful some of these social stories can be, just how powerful getting sucked into comparisons with other people can be. And it's really difficult for us to get off that treadmill, once we get sucked in. Now, just coming to thinking about spending money again. One of the other things that Amy wanted me to talk about was the altruism issue, and I might mention David Beckham. She said I had to try and get David Beckham in because you'll all know who he is, and you all love football, and everyone loves David Beckham, and everyone loves football. Now, David Beckham, I don't know if any of you saw this story, but David Beckham, a few years ago, he had his emails hacked. It was emails that he was sending to his agent, where he was basically, in very, very colourful language, was upset that he hadn't been recognised in the honours list. Like, in the UK we have these crazy things, honours. We give people knighthoods. The Queen puts a sword on someone's shoulders when they're kneeling down, right? So we call them Sir, and they get MBEs, OBEs, and whatever else you can get. We have a massive honours system dating back to prehistoric times. And he was pretty annoyed that he hadn't been recognised for all of the work that he'd done for UNICEF. He's, as many of you all know, he set up Beckham 7 charity. All the salary that he earned when he was at Paris Saint-Germain went into that charity, went to UNICEF. He's done untold good in helping people, poor kids around the world. And he just wanted a little bit of recognition for that. Now, I don't think David Beckham did those things in order to get the recognition. I think he did those things, and after the fact thought, actually, it'd be quite nice if someone said thank you. And he got absolutely vilified for this. I mean, it was like one of the most heinous crimes that he could have ever committed, as if it undermined people like Piers Morgan waded in, and they were all like, as if this undermined all that he'd done. What a stupid story. The idea, what you should do is go and find some of those kids that David Beckham's helped, and then say, would you like us to take the money back? Because David Beckham now wants recognition for what he's done. Of course they wouldn't. We have this idea, this narrative of pro-sociality, that it ought to be cleansed entirely of any self-interest or benefit. And that's harmful. That's actively harmful for society. We get much less pro-sociality than we might otherwise if we celebrated the selfishness of our altruism. this is one area where we do have very, very many good causal studies. We have good randomized controlled trials that tap in that in different conditions tap into different degrees of self-interest, and the evidence is overwhelmingly clear. There's like lots of areas it's a bit messy and murky, but here the evidence is overwhelmingly clear. When you draw attention to the personal benefits that come from helping other people, you get more of it. You get more volunteering, you get more charitable giving. And why not, right? I mean, it's great that we're helping other people. That's a good thing. Of course it is. But it benefits ourselves. Even if you just feel a little bit happier and you walk a little bit taller yourself, there's nothing wrong with that. We shouldn't be trying to cleanse pro-sociality of any personal benefits. I would actively encourage you, and I'm conscious of time, so I need to wrap up soon, that you will be happier when you use your assets and your wealth and your time in ways that help other people. They benefit and you benefit too. So as a final kind of call to arms, I guess, I'm kind of asking us to ditch this idea that we can't personally benefit and shouldn't personally benefit from helping other people, to actively embrace it and celebrate it, and to go out there and do more good in the world. Amy, is that a good place? That feels like a good place to conclude. Is that...
Sounds
you can't speak
absolutely
to me,
perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ah, there you are. Brilliant. It's nice to hear your voice. I've just seen you on the screen for the last half an hour. It's nice to... is that time up? Do you want to ask me a question or not? Or have we got time for any?
Yeah, I think we're good on our side. I think you covered all of it.
Okay.
And thank you for the David Beckham story.
Brilliant. I ticked off everything you asked me to do in your email.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, everybody, for paying attention.
Yes, and we now know how valuable that attention is.
It's the scarcest resource. Your time is the scarcest resource. Allocate it wisely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I hope that all of you found that as enlightening and interesting as I did. I personally really find the happiness literature is often very surprising, but very exciting. And as someone who's dedicated this time to financial services, I find that it's always that reminder that we want to make sure that money serves people and not the other way around. And having that understanding of the role of attention, of where happiness comes from, it allows us to crystallize our investment goals so much more specifically. To think about the fact that our goals are not just a number and a time frame. They're about a specific way of investing our attention. They're a specific flow of experiences for pleasure or for purpose. And how does that connect to your life as a whole? There's been some interesting research in South Africa on even retired people and how they draw happiness, and it really confirms what we see in the global literature. So I hope that's really enriched and broadened your sense of what happiness is and how to think about your investment goals in a way that really allows you to get the most happiness out of them.